Everyone knows the name Hemi, the symbol of American power, of roaring NASCAR glory and the muscle car era that made Detroit the capital of speed. But here's the shocking truth. Before the legendary 426 Hemi was born, Chrysler had already unleashed another monster, the 426 Wedge 5.8. Born during the early 1960s horsepower madness, the 426 Wedge wasn't built for luxury. It was engineered to dominate. With its wedge-shaped combustion chambers, high compression ratio, and thunderous roar, it terrified Ford and Chevrolet alike. And yet, only a few years later, Chrysler almost erased the 426 Wedge from history, as if it had never existed. Why would a record-breaking engine, once feared at Daytona, be buried by its own creator? The answer behind that decision reveals one of the most shocking secrets of Detroit's golden age. In the early 1960s, Detroit entered what many called the Horsepower Wars, a ruthless battle where Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors fought to build the most powerful V8 in America. Chrysler was known for its durability and engineering precision, but it was often seen as too conservative, lacking the raw aggression of Ford's 390 or Chevrolet's 409. Inside Chrysler's headquarters, engineers knew that if they didn't strike back soon, they'd be left behind in the rising tide of muscle cars. In 1962, Chrysler unveiled the Max Wedge 413, featuring wedge-shaped combustion chambers, a clever design that was simpler, lighter, and easier to produce than the complex Hemi heads. But just 1 year later, they pushed the limits further, enlarging displacement to 426 cubic inches, creating a true monster. The 426 Wedge 5.8. The block was made from high-strength cast iron, with thick cylinder walls and reinforced main bearing webs to handle extreme combustion pressure. Displacement measured 426 cubic inches, achieved through a 4.25-inch bore and 3.75-inch stroke, a short-stroke layout ideal for high rev performance without sacrificing longevity. The 30-degree wedge-shaped cylinder heads were the engine's defining feature. The wedge combustion chamber design allowed for a more efficient air-fuel burn and faster flame propagation. It was simpler and cheaper to manufacture than the hemispherical Hemi head, while still maintaining excellent volumetric efficiency. The intake system used a cross-ram manifold with two long crisscrossed runners feeding twin Carter AFB 4-barrel carburetors. This layout optimized airflow velocity in the mid-RPM range, boosting torque at around 3,000 RPM. Complementing it was the long ram exhaust manifold, designed to improve scavenging and minimize back pressure. A high-lift camshaft, paired with an 11:1 compression ratio, allowed the 426 Wedge to produce an advertised 425 horsepower at 5,600 RPM and 480 pound-feet of torque at 4,000 RPM. Internal testing, however, indicated real-world output exceeding 470 horsepower, depending on carburetor tuning and intake configuration. When it entered the 1963 NASCAR season, the 426 Wedge 5.8 quickly proved its true purpose: to dominate high-speed racing. Chrysler equipped the engine in the Dodge Polara, Plymouth Belvedere, and Savoy, transforming them into nearly unbeatable race cars at Daytona and Charlotte. With gearing optimized for long straightaways, the 426 Wedge pushed Chrysler's cars to speeds exceeding 160 miles per hour, a figure far beyond NASCAR's expectations at the time. The cross-ram intake and high compression setup provided stable traction even at sustained high RPM, allowing smooth, continuous acceleration down the straights without constant shifting. In practice, the Wedge delivered a more linear and dependable power curve than Ford's 427 FE or Chevrolet's 409. Throughout the 1963 season, teams like Petty Enterprises and Ray Nichols Engineering dominated with consecutive victories. At the Daytona 500, Richard Petty captured pole position with an average speed over 154 miles per hour, driving a Plymouth powered by the 426 Wedge. Its aerodynamic efficiency and high-speed stability made it nearly untouchable. NASCAR officials began to question the massive performance gap and demanded Chrysler's technical data. When they discovered that real output far exceeded the published rating, NASCAR temporarily re-evaluated the engine's eligibility in production-based classes. This proved that even before the 426 Hemi arrived, Chrysler already had the engineering foundation to rule NASCAR. After proving its dominance on the NASCAR circuit, Chrysler decided to bring the 426 Wedge to the streets, a bold but risky move. The production version, known as the Max Wedge, perfectly embodied that ambition. Unlike most civilian V8s of its era, the 426 Max Wedge remained virtually identical to its race version. Chrysler didn't soften the intake, camshaft, or combustion chambers. It only made minor adjustments for pump gas and improved starting behavior in everyday use. This made it one of the very few production V8s to share nearly all critical components with its NASCAR counterpart. In terms of driving dynamics, the Max Wedge reflected Chrysler's core philosophy. The engine was always stronger than the chassis. The immense torque and sharp throttle response gave explosive acceleration, but demanded precise control from the driver. With either a 4-speed manual or TorqueFlite automatic transmission, the Polara and Savoy delivered near-race performance, though taming that power on public roads remained a challenge. Braking and suspension systems were largely unchanged from standard models, creating a clear imbalance between power and handling, a common trait among early 1960s factory hot rods. Yet, for performance purists, that imbalance was part of the charm. The Max Wedge was a street car with a racer's heart, untamed, unapologetic, and brutally honest. While the 426 Wedge was dominating NASCAR, a quiet storm was brewing inside Chrysler. Veteran engineers insisted that the Wedge still had untapped potential, but a younger, more ambitious group argued that the company needed to return to its earlier philosophy, the Hemi hemispherical head, which had brought Chrysler fame in the 1950s. That internal conflict birthed the 426 Hemi, but it also marked the beginning of Chrysler's deliberate effort to erase the Wedge from its official narrative. Technically, the Wedge was far from obsolete. Its wedge-shaped combustion chamber delivered exceptional mid-range torque and reliability, perfect for production cars and drag racing. But as NASCAR speeds climbed past 160 miles per hour, engineers began to see its aerodynamic limits. To reach 500 horsepower without increasing displacement, they needed a hemispherical chamber, one that allowed the intake and exhaust valves to breathe independently and reduce turbulence at high RPM. Chrysler soon realized that Hemi wasn't just an engineering solution, it was a marketing weapon. When the first Hemi-powered cars swept the 1964 Daytona 500, the American press exploded with the phrase Hemi 426. In that instant, Chrysler saw that the word Hemi carried more brand power than any engine designation in its history. To make that legend shine, the company had to do the unthinkable: bury the Wedge. By 1965, the Wedge name vanished from brochures, technical sheets, and even internal documents. Chrysler wanted the world to believe that Hemi was a divine creation, not an evolution of the Wedge. In reality, both shared the same RB block, bore spacing, and crankshaft geometry. But in marketing terms, the Hemi had to stand alone, a symbol of raw power with no predecessor to share the glory. Inside Chrysler, the divide was stark. Engineers believed the Wedge could have evolved, lighter, cheaper, and still competitive. But marketing executives saw something more profitable. The Hemi could sell cars. It wasn't just an engine. It was a sub-brand, a cultural badge that could be printed on hoods, jackets, and even racing merchandise. The Hemi's early victories silenced the debate. Chrysler rewrote its own history, reducing the Wedge to a prototype chapter before the hero arrived. Many engineers felt betrayed, knowing that the Hemi could only exist because the Wedge had paved the way. But instead of burying everything about the Wedge, Chrysler's engineers continued to use the Wedge structure for the RB and B series engines, such as the 383, 413, 426 Street Wedge, and especially the 440 Magnum. These machines not only inherited the engineering philosophy of the 426 Wedge, straight intake paths, reasonable valve angles, and long piston strokes for maximum torque, but also proved that Chrysler's simple but strong mindset remained a winning formula. For drivers, the Wedge offered a raw and honest feel, power not born from sophistication, but from the precision of pure mechanics. However, as America entered the 1970s, the muscle car era collapsed under oil crises and emission regulations, and the Wedge line gradually disappeared from production. The Hemi was reborn in legend, while the Wedge quietly faded into obscurity. It no longer appeared in advertisements, had no badges of its own, and was mentioned only in service manuals or in the memories of those who once worked at the Highland Park plant. Yet that very forgotten status made the Wedge special in the eyes of collectors. At Mopar gatherings, you can always find Plymouth Belvedere Max Wedges or Dodge Polara 426 meticulously restored, standing modestly among rows of brilliant Hemis. To them, the Wedge is not just the Hemi's predecessor, it is the most primitive mechanical heart of Mopar. A cold piece of iron that carries the spirit of Detroit, precise, powerful, and uncompromising. In recent years, the Mopar enthusiast community has begun to redefine the Wedge's value. Forums like Moparts and Classic Dodge Revival frequently share documents, blueprints, and stories of the engineers who quietly built this legend. The collector value of cars powered by the 426 Max Wedge has been rising rapidly, not for their horsepower, but for their historical significance. For it stands as the bridge between two generations, between the ruggedness of classic engineering and the refinement of the modern Hemi. If you believe the 426 Wedge deserves to be remembered as a vital part of Mopar history, help keep its story alive. Hit like if you respect the era when power was built from steel and human hands. Comment below if you've ever seen, driven, or dreamed of hearing the growl of a Wedge. And don't forget to subscribe. Together, we'll uncover more forgotten legends, engines, and machines that defined Detroit's golden age. Every share keeps this memory alive. Every interaction helps remind the world that true greatness isn't just measured in horsepower. It's in the stories that refuse to fade, even after half a century.